I spent nearly 40 years working as a ranger and hunter in the mountains of Montana, so I once thought I understood every sound and every creature in those woods. But one late autumn night shattered everything I believed to be true. A giant creature the whole world calls Bigfoot knocked on the door of my wooden cabin. It did not growl, did not attack, and did not run away when I pointed my gun at it. Instead, it knelt down in front of me, bowing its head as if it were begging. The next morning, after everything was over, nearly 20 Bigfoot stood silently in front of my porch to say thank you in a way I would never forget for the rest of my life. My name is Ethan Mercer. I am 68 years old now, and most of my life has been tied to the forests stretching across the mountains of Montana. Some people used to call me a ranger. Some called me a hunter out of habit. But if I had to introduce myself, I would say I am simply a man who spent too many years learning how to listen to the forest. I know when deer begin moving down into the valleys before winter. I know how the sound of a branch snapped by a black bear differs from the footsteps of an elk. And I know that when the entire forest suddenly falls silent, a predator has appeared somewhere nearby. 40 years of that work taught me that nature has its own rules, and people are truly safe only when they learn to respect those rules. After retiring, I stayed in my small wooden cabin deep in the woods instead of moving down to town, as many people advised me to do. Life here is so simple that many would find it boring. But to me, silence has always been more comforting than traffic noise and polite social conversations. Until that late autumn night, I believed I had seen almost everything that could exist in this forest. As it turned out, the most important thing life wanted me to witness only appeared when I no longer expected anything surprising at all. Before you continue listening to this story, take a moment to share your thoughts. Do you believe in Bigfoot? And if you have a story like mine, do not hesitate to share it below so everyone can hear it. That night came later than usual, because I was still sitting under the oil lamp, repairing a few old traps. Hunting season had already ended, but I still kept the habit of checking every spring, every chain link, and every length of cable, simply to keep my hands busy. Outside, the early winter wind moved through the tall pines, creating the deep, steady sounds I had heard for decades. Inside the little cabin, there were only the soft clinks of metal, the crackle of firewood in the stove, and the sound of my pencil occasionally scratching a few lines into my notebook. The wall clock had just passed 9 when a very soft sound came from the front door. 3 slow knocks spaced so evenly that I lifted my head at once. When you live in the woods as long as I have, you develop a very strange reflex. The moment you hear an unfamiliar sound, your mind automatically tries to identify what it belongs to. A branch hitting the door has an uneven rhythm shaped by the wind. A dry limb falling onto the roof makes a heavier, sharper sound. Bears usually rub their backs against the wooden wall before trying to find food, but the sound I had just heard was like someone deliberately knocking on the door with a hand. I set the trap down on the table and listened for a few more seconds. Outside, everything returned to silence. I told myself perhaps some hiker had gotten lost, or maybe someone's car had broken down on the dirt road a few miles away. That sometimes happened whenever the weather turned cold too quickly. I stood and walked to the gun rack beside the door, out of habit from my years as a ranger. I did not pick up the gun right away. I only rested my hand on the wooden grip, enough to feel secure if something unexpected happened. When my other hand had just touched the doorknob, the 3 knocks came again, still gentle, still calm, as if whoever stood outside was waiting very patiently for me to open the door. I turned the lock and pulled the heavy wooden door aside. Cold air rushed into the cabin at once, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine resin. For the first moment, I thought my eyes had fooled me, because standing on the porch was a giant, human-like shadow beneath the dim moonlight. Only when the light from inside the cabin spilled over that body did I see the thick brown fur covering it from the shoulders down to the arms, the broad face with deep-set eyes, and a height far beyond any man I had ever met. I froze in the doorway. The creature also stood silently, looking straight at me with eyes I would never forget, not even once, for the rest of my life. During my years as a ranger, I had heard countless Bigfoot stories. Truck drivers said they had seen a giant black shape crossing the road near midnight. Some hunters insisted they had found unusually large footprints after heavy snow. Every now and then, the local newspaper printed blurry photos so unclear no one could say what they showed. I always listened to those stories with respect, but I never truly accepted them as fact. The vast forest has a way of tricking human sight and imagination, especially on cold nights, or when fear begins to creep into the mind. So, when I saw the giant creature standing right on my porch, the first thing that entered my mind was not wonder. It was instinct forcing my body to prepare for the worst. My hand tightened around the gun beside the door, and my eyes followed every tiny movement of the creature in front of me. I noticed its massive chest rising and falling with heavy breaths as if it had traveled a very long distance. White vapor kept dissolving into the night each time it exhaled, while both arms hung at its sides with an unusual exhaustion. The yellow light from the oil lamp shone across its dark furred face, making its large, deep brown eyes stand out, and that was what confused me most. The eyes before me carried an emotion I had only ever seen in human beings: exhaustion, worry, and the faint hope left behind after too many disappointments. The creature stood still for a few more seconds, then suddenly lowered its body. At first, I thought it was preparing to launch forward, so every muscle in me tightened. But the next movement happened with strange slowness. One knee touched the ground in front of the porch, and then the other lowered after it. Its wide back bent slightly, both large hands rested on the ground, and its head lowered as if offering me a special kind of respect. I stood motionless, feeling as if time had stretched longer than normal. A creature nearly 9 feet tall, with strength surely far beyond any man's, had chosen to kneel in front of an old man living alone in the woods. The scene contradicted everything I had ever imagined about Bigfoot. Before I could understand what was happening, the creature lifted its head slightly. Its eyes were red from exhaustion, and in the corners of those eyes, the lamplight reflected the shimmer of moisture gathering there. From its throat came a series of deep, hoarse sounds, slow in rhythm, like someone trying to remain calm while speaking. I did not understand the meaning of those sounds, but my instinct told me I was witnessing a plea, not a threat. I still held the gun in my hand, but for the first time since opening the door, I realized I was no longer thinking about pulling the trigger. I only wanted to know what could make a mysterious creature, one strong enough to vanish into the forest where no one could find it, come to an old man's cabin in the cold night, and humble itself to ask for help. Bigfoot slowly reached its right arm forward. Its hand was large enough to wrap around my entire head, but the movement was strangely careful. Its long fingers stopped only a few inches from my wrist, as if it were giving me the choice to accept contact or not. I did not step back. After a few seconds of hesitation, the tips of its rough fingers lightly touched the sleeve of my coat. The touch was so gentle that I almost only felt its warmth through the thick fabric. It stayed that way for a moment, then slowly lowered its hand. Right after that, Bigfoot turned its head toward the dark forest behind it. It looked into the space between the tall pine trunks, then turned back to me. The gesture repeated twice more, each time clearer than the last. I began to understand that it was trying to direct my attention towards somewhere deep in the woods. When it saw me still standing still, Bigfoot stood up, backed a few steps toward the trail, and stopped. It turned its head to look at me with very patient expectation. When I still did not react, it stepped closer again, lightly touched my wrist once more, then immediately turned back toward the forest. By then, its intention was too clear for me to fool myself with any other explanation. This creature had not come to my cabin looking for food or shelter for the night. It was trying to lead me somewhere, and the matter was important enough that it had been willing to kneel before a strange human being. I could feel the urgency in every look it gave me. Each time it looked toward the forest, its eyes flashed with impatience, as if time were running out. The instinct of a man who had taken part in many forest rescues suddenly rose inside me. I had seen that same look in fathers running for help after their children were injured in the mountains, in desperate mothers standing beside the creek where their child had just been swept away. The only difference was that the one pleading with me tonight belonged to a species the whole world considered only a legend. It was at that moment I understood that the being before me was no longer a mystery. In my eyes, it was simply a father trying to find one last chance to save his child. I stood for a long time in the doorway while the early season cold wind kept blowing across the small yard before the cabin. All I had to do was step back inside and close the door, and perhaps everything would have ended right there. I could have convinced myself that what I had seen was only an illusion caused by age or moonlight. The next morning I could still wake up, make coffee, continue my familiar life, and leave that mystery to dissolve into the forest. But each time that thought appeared, the creature's eyes pulled me back to a memory I had tried to bury for many years. I remembered Hannah during her final days in the hospital. The doctors had done everything they could, and I could only sit beside her bed, holding the hand that grew colder and colder. Hannah did not cry, and she never complained. She only looked at me with eyes both peaceful and regretful, as if saying there were still so many things she wanted to stay with me for. I had watched the woman I loved most leave my life, without being able to change the ending. That feeling had never truly disappeared. It had only lain quietly in a corner of my heart, waiting until that night to awaken. When I looked into Bigfoot's eyes, I suddenly recognized the same despair I had once seen in that hospital room. It was the look of someone who knew time was almost gone, but was still clinging to one final hope. I slowly loosened my hand from the gun. The weapon that had been with me for nearly half my life suddenly felt meaningless before that silent plea. I turned back into the cabin, placed the gun on the wooden rack, and pulled the medical rescue backpack down from the nail on the wall. I opened it and quickly checked every item by habit from my days doing forest rescue. There was still enough gauze. The antiseptic had not expired. Sutures, a medical knife, painkillers, a few bottles of antibiotics, and a backup flashlight were all in their proper places. I put on a thicker coat, pulled on waterproof boots, and turned down the lamp inside the cabin. When I stepped back out, Bigfoot was still standing where it had been. It looked at the backpack on my shoulder, and its eyes softened in a way I had never seen in any animal. The creature turned slightly toward the trail leading into the woods and began walking at a steady pace, just slow enough for me to keep up. Before leaving the yard, I looked back at my wooden cabin one last time. In that moment, a very strange thought passed through my mind. I still believed I was going into the night forest to save some life out there. But years later, when I looked back, I realized that night had opened the path to the meeting that would completely change the rest of my life. We left the cabin after darkness had fully covered the forest. I walked about 15 feet behind the creature, keeping enough distance to observe its movements without making it feel chased. The headlamp only lit a small area ahead of me, while most of the trail remained buried in thick darkness beneath the ancient pines. If anyone else had seen me, they would probably have thought I had lost my mind by following a creature the world still treated as legend. But the farther I walked, the more I realized fear was no longer guiding me. What pushed me forward was the feeling that someone desperately needed help, and that every passing minute could decide whether they lived or died. Bigfoot moved with a steady rhythm, faster than my stride, but always just slow enough for me to follow. Sometimes, when the path grew steeper or fallen trunks blocked the way, it stopped on a rock ledge ahead and turned back to look at me. Only after seeing that I had crossed a difficult obstruction did it continue. That gesture repeated so often that I realized this creature was always checking whether I was still behind it. It reminded me of young rangers who had once patrolled with me many years before. Whenever I led a new colleague through the woods at night, I often stopped at bends to make sure no one had been left behind. That very ordinary similarity made the distance between human and mysterious creature feel a little smaller. We crossed a shallow creek where the icy water reflected the faint moonlight. The water only reached my ankles, but moss covered the rocks, so I had to move carefully. Bigfoot had already crossed to the other side. When it saw me stumble on a slick stone, it turned back and waited, watching every step I took with patience. After I steadied myself, it continued guiding me. The trail began climbing a slope covered in dry pine needles. I breathed harder because age had made my legs weaker than they used to be, while Bigfoot kept its steady pace. A few times I had to stop to catch my breath, and every time it stood still ahead of me, silently observing until I signaled that I was all right. I suddenly understood that if its only goal had been to take me somewhere as fast as possible, it could have left me behind long ago. Instead, it adjusted its speed to match the ability of an almost 70-year-old man, as if it understood that the one carrying the final hope for someone ahead was the same person walking behind it. That thought made me tighten the strap of the medical backpack on my shoulder and continue deeper into the forest, where every mile brought me closer to a secret I had never imagined could exist in this world. We walked for nearly another hour before the forest began to change. The dense pines that had crowded the trail behind us slowly opened into a wider space, still covered by ancient tree canopies so tall that moonlight slipped down only in thin silver streaks across the ground. I realized I had entered an area I had never set foot in during all my 40 years in the mountains, even though I knew almost every trail in the region by memory. Bigfoot led me along a moss-covered rock wall, then slipped through a narrow gap between two huge boulders. Without it walking ahead, I would have assumed that place was only a natural stone wall and would never have thought to search for a path through it. The moment I stepped through the rock gap, the scene before me made me stop completely. Beyond the thick trees was a hidden valley, entirely separated from the rest of the forest. The space was larger than I expected, surrounded by high stone cliffs and enormous pines like a natural wall protecting everything inside. In the middle of the valley was a flat clearing where a small fire burned low, spreading warm light through the cold night. What made me hold my breath was not the fire, but the beings gathered around it. A female Bigfoot with a smaller build sat near the entrance of a stone hollow, both arms holding something tightly against her chest. A few steps away, two adult Bigfoot stood still, watching my every movement. Farther back, I saw two young Bigfoot hiding behind a large rock, showing only half of their curious faces. They kept looking at me, then ducking back behind their mother like children, seeing a stranger for the first time. Near the fire sat an old Bigfoot with silver fur covering its shoulders and back. It sat on a low stone slab, its back slightly bent with age, its calm eyes fixed on me. Though I had never met this creature before, I clearly felt it held a special place in the group. Without any obvious command gesture, the others all looked toward it before reacting. It felt very similar to my old ranger team, where everyone would unconsciously look to the most experienced person whenever facing a difficult situation. The Bigfoot that had brought me here released a few deep, slow sounds. Immediately, the tension on the faces of the group eased slightly. The old Bigfoot gave a small nod and extended its hand toward the ground before it, as if inviting me to come closer. None of the creatures showed panic or tried to surround me. They only quietly watched every step of the strange man who had just entered a place perhaps no human had ever set foot in before. I walked slowly toward the fire, feeling dozens of eyes following me. What surprised me most was how this family existed together. Beside neatly stacked bundles of firewood were several logs used as seats. In another corner, bark and dry pine branches were arranged in piles like stored materials. A few cleaned fish lay near a flat stone, and wild fruits had been gathered into a natural hollow inside a fallen trunk. Everything looked simple and rough, yet carried the orderliness of a home that had existed for a long time. In that moment, I no longer felt as if I were standing inside the den of a mysterious species. I felt as though I had entered the living space of a family trying to survive a great crisis, and all of them were placing their final hope in the stranger who had appeared in the cold night. While I was still observing the scene before me, the Bigfoot that had brought me there slowly moved toward the female sitting near the stone hollow. It gently placed one hand on its mate's shoulder in reassurance. The mother Bigfoot looked up at it, then immediately turned her eyes toward me. In those eyes, red from lack of sleep, I saw the exhaustion of a mother who had stayed awake for many nights caring for a gravely sick child. She took a deep breath, then gently shifted aside. It was in that moment I finally saw why I had been brought all the way there. A young Bigfoot lay on a careful bed of pine needles and animal hides spread across the stone floor. At a glance, I guessed it was only about 5 or 6 years old compared with human development. The light brown fur around its face was still soft and sparse, and its hands were far smaller than those of the adults. The first thing I noticed was its breathing. Each inhale was heavy and broken. Its chest rose and fell too quickly, as if the body were fighting a long fever. Its face, which should have been lively, was flushed with heat, and its eyes only opened halfway before closing again in exhaustion. I knelt beside the child, set the medical backpack on the ground, and gently placed my hand on its forehead. Even through the thick fur, I could feel the abnormal heat of its body. Years of forest rescue taught me that a long fever combined with an open wound usually meant the infection had spread deep. I gently pulled aside the hide, covering its legs, and immediately understood why the father had traveled miles through the night to my cabin. The young Bigfoot's left leg was still trapped in an old steel trap. It was the type of trap once used for wolves and mountain lions, often illegally hidden in the forest by poachers years earlier. I had removed many of them during my ranger years, so one look was enough for me to recognize the familiar spring and jaw mechanism. The trap had probably been there for a long time, hidden beneath dry leaves, until the child accidentally stepped into it. The 2 steel jaws had clamped around the lower leg for days, crushing the soft flesh near the ankle. Blood was no longer flowing heavily, but the skin around the wound had turned dark purple, mixed with black patches showing that the tissue had begun to rot. The faint smell of infection in the air made my heart feel heavy. If we were delayed by even 1 or 2 more days, the child's chance of survival would be very small. I looked toward the mother Bigfoot. She was still holding her child's arm with both large hands, her eyes never leaving the small fevered face. From time to time, she gently stroked the child's forehead with the tips of her fingers, exactly like any human mother I had ever known. The father knelt across from me, his wide shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Only then did I notice that the fur on his forearms and knees was covered in mud and fresh scratches. He had probably crossed the entire forest at night, through rocks and thorn bushes, just to find a human who might save his child. Around us, the other adult Bigfoot kept their distance. No one moved too close. No one showed impatience. Every eye turned to me, then back to the child lying motionless on the stone floor. Even the old Bigfoot slowly pushed itself up and stepped a little closer before stopping. It lowered its head and looked at the child for a long time before gently placing one hand over its own chest. I did not understand the meaning of that gesture, but somehow I could feel the shared worry covering the entire family. In that moment, every prejudice I had ever heard about Bigfoot seemed to vanish completely. Before me were no longer mysterious creatures from rumors. I only saw a family trying to hold on to the life of a small child with the last hope they could find. And the one they had placed that trust in, by a very strange twist of fate, was me. I took a very slow breath to keep my mind clear. Years earlier, when I was still a ranger, I had handled quite a few cases of hikers whose legs had been caught in animal traps. Whether the victim was human or animal, the first rule was always the same. Free the trapped limb as quickly as possible, then assess the damage to decide the next step. I opened the medical backpack, took out a pair of medical gloves, and looked toward the father Bigfoot. I pointed at the trap, then at the child's leg, then gestured that I needed to touch it. The creature looked at me for a few seconds, then gave a small nod. It was a tiny gesture, but I understood I had just received the most important consent. I knelt closer and used both hands to examine the steel trap mechanism. The metal was covered in rust, but the pressure of the jaws was still extremely strong. I took the small pry bar from my tool pouch, carefully inserted it between the two springs, and pressed down with all my body weight. It took nearly a full minute before the steel jaws began opening little by little. As soon as the gap was wide enough, I gently lifted the young Bigfoot's leg free from the trap. The child jerked hard from pain. Its half-closed eyes suddenly opened wide, and it released a weak, painful cry. The mother immediately held its shoulders, while the father knelt closer, placing both large hands on the stone floor to steady himself. I could feel the air around me tightening like a rope about to snap. One wrong decision, and every ounce of trust they had just given me would disappear. I took a bottle of sterile saline and cleaned away the dried blood and dirt around the wound. The moment the water touched the infected flesh, the child trembled again. I gently placed my hand on its small arm as if to comfort it before continuing. Once the mud was cleared, the entire injury appeared more clearly under my flashlight. A patch of flesh around the ankle had turned completely black. I knew that if I left that dead tissue there, the infection would spread faster. The decision to cut away dead tissue is always the hardest one, especially when you have no anesthetic and the patient is only a child. I took out the small surgical knife, sterilized it carefully, and looked toward the father Bigfoot. Our eyes met for a second. Perhaps he did not understand exactly what I was about to do, but he slowly took both of his child's hands and held the small body steady. The mother gently pressed her forehead against the child's forehead, releasing low, even sounds like a lullaby. I began cutting away the dead tissue with the shortest, most careful motions I could make. Sweat covered my forehead, even though the cave air was cold. Each time the child's body tensed from pain, my heart tightened, but my hands had to remain steady. Around us, the entire Bigfoot family stood silent in tense waiting. No one came closer. Every bit of hope rested on my aging hands. After nearly an hour of continuous work, the last dead tissue was removed. I applied antiseptic, sprinkled antibiotic powder over the wound, and wrapped clean gauze several times around the lower leg to secure it. When I finished the final knot, I sat back slightly and let out a slow breath. I did not know whether the child would survive the infection, but at least from that moment it had a chance to keep fighting for its life. After finishing the bandage, I took a fever-reducing tablet from my backpack and crushed it with the back of my folding knife. I mixed the powder with a little clean water in my metal cup, then gestured for the mother Bigfoot to lift the child's head slightly. She watched each movement closely, then gently followed as if she understood. I carefully gave the child tiny sips so it could swallow more easily. At first, most of the water slipped from the corner of its mouth because its body was too weak, but after several tries, faint swallowing reflexes returned. I placed the back of my hand on the child's forehead again. The temperature was still very high, but its breathing had become more even, no longer as frantic as when I first arrived. That was not enough to say the danger had passed, but it gave me a small ray of hope that had barely existed before. I leaned back against the stone wall and quietly watched the family's reaction. The father Bigfoot still knelt beside his child, both large hands resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving the small face now sinking into sleep from exhaustion. After a long while, he gently reached out and took my wrist. This time, the gesture no longer carried the desperation it had held before he came to my cabin. The huge hand only squeezed very lightly, then released. But I understood it as his way of expressing gratitude. At that exact moment, the young Bigfoot stirred slightly. Its eyes, which had been tightly shut, slowly opened. It looked at me for a few seconds, as if trying to recognize the strange face sitting beside it, then weakly extended a small hand covered in brown fur. Its fingers lightly wrapped around my index finger with just enough force for me to feel warmth, slowly returning to that small body. In that moment, a series of deep, drawn-out sounds rose all around the valley. The old Bigfoot lowered its head. The mother closed her eyes in relief. The others quietly looked toward the child. I did not understand their language, but I understood the feeling. It was the moment an entire family saw hope return after days of waiting in despair. I did not return to my cabin that night. After checking the bandage one last time, I looked at the medicine and equipment left in my backpack and quickly understood this trip could not end after only a few hours. The child's wound had been treated, but the greatest concern now was infection. If the fever did not fall or the wound continued swelling and producing pus, everything I had done would become meaningless. I had seen people survive the first operation in the woods only to die days later from infection. That experience made it impossible for me to leave the child when its chance of survival was still so fragile. I turned toward the father Bigfoot, pointed to the child's leg, then pointed at myself. Then I lifted my hand like the rising sun and lowered it like the setting sun. I hoped the simple gesture would be enough to say that I needed to stay for a few more days. The creature watched closely, then turned to look at the old Bigfoot. After a short silence, the elder slowly stepped closer to me. Although old, its walk remained steady. It looked at the medical backpack, then at the sleeping child, then gently placed one hand on its chest and bowed its head. That gesture made me feel as if I had just been welcomed to stay with the most sincere respect. I smiled in return and began looking for a corner near the stone hollow where I could spread the thin blanket I had brought. It was not a comfortable place to rest, but it was enough for me to monitor the child through the night. The mother Bigfoot soon brought a thicker animal hide and placed it beside where I sat. She said nothing, only gently pushed the hide toward me before returning to her child. I pulled it over my legs, and my heart suddenly felt warm in a way that was hard to describe. Since the moment I had stepped into this valley, not one creature had shown hostility toward me. Caution was still there, but behind those watchful eyes, trust was slowly beginning to form. Near dawn, the young Bigfoot's fever had not fallen much. I kept changing cool cloths, checking breathing and pulse in the way I had always done with injured people in the forest. Each time I moved closer, the mother gave me space to work, while the father sat silently behind her, watching every movement with absolute focus. When the first light slipped through the pines and fell into the valley, I opened the bandage to inspect the wound. The tissue around the ankle was still swollen, but its color was less purple than the night before. There was no new smell of rotting tissue, which showed the antibiotics were beginning to work. I breathed out in relief and changed to a fresh bandage. As I worked, I felt many eyes watching behind me. 2 young Bigfoot hid behind a large tree, occasionally peeking toward me and whispering to each other in tiny sounds. One adult brought several dry branches to add to the fire, while another carried fresh creek water in a large wooden shell and placed it beside me. I did not need to ask for anything. They seemed to understand what I needed to keep caring for the child. By then, I suddenly realized I no longer felt like a lost man in a strange place. I was sitting in the middle of a family united by one purpose, keeping a child alive. And in a very natural way, I had become part of that effort. The second day in the valley was when I began observing the life of the Bigfoot family more, instead of focusing only on the child's wound. The fever had gone down gradually, the antibiotics seemed to be working, and the bandage remained dry. I still checked the child's leg every few hours, but the time between bandage changes gave me enough space to quietly watch how the group lived together. The first thing that surprised me was how orderly everything was, without any shouting or fighting. When a group of adult Bigfoot returned from the forest, carrying fish and bundles of large roots, they placed all the food near the fire. No one claimed a portion first. They all stepped back and waited for the old Bigfoot to approach. The elder bent down, inspected each kind of food, then gently pushed one portion toward the mother caring for the sick child. After that, it divided food for 2 older individuals before the stronger members received the rest. That way of sharing reminded me of many farming families I had known in Montana. The elderly and children were always given priority, while those still strong enough to work rarely cared whether they ate a little more or less. I had never imagined I would witness the same principle in a species humans still called wild. Near noon, the mother Bigfoot tried feeding the child a few mashed wild berries. She sat against the stone wall, letting the child lean against her chest, then patiently offered small portions one at a time. Whenever the child grew tired and turned away, she did not force it. She only gently stroked the little head and waited until it was ready to continue. During all that time, the father never left the area near the cave entrance. He constantly watched the surroundings, sometimes walking a circle around the valley before returning. I gradually understood that his duty was to make sure everything was safe, while his mate spent all her time caring for their child. When the sun rose higher, 2 adult Bigfoot began repairing the branch shelter above the stone hollow. One climbed nearby pines to cut more branches, while the other arranged them carefully in layers to block the wind. Their work was so smooth it almost required no communication. A few glances or hand movements were enough for them to know what the other needed. It reminded me of experienced rescue teams where members have worked together so long that they can coordinate without many words. In the afternoon, I carried the old bandages I had changed to the creek to wash away the remaining blood. As I bent down beside the water, I heard footsteps behind me. A fairly young Bigfoot carried a large dry log and placed it near the bank. It picked up several stones, arranged them into a flat little surface, and pointed at it as if trying to give me a clean place to put my supplies. I smiled and nodded in thanks. It looked at me for a few seconds, then bowed slightly before returning toward the valley. We still could not speak a single understandable word to each other. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized kindness does not always need language. That evening, the whole family gathered around the fire. A few young Bigfoot sat close to the older ones, while the adults took turns adding wood to keep the flames steady. The mother stayed beside the injured child, while the father brought me a piece of fish roasted on a hot stone. He placed it in front of me, then stepped back, his eyes carrying a waiting look, as if wanting to know whether I would accept it. I took the fish, broke off a small piece, and ate it right in front of him. His huge face relaxed slightly, as if a worry had just been lifted. Perhaps, in his mind, my willingness to eat the food his family offered was a sign that I had truly accepted them. Sitting in the flickering firelight of a Montana mountain night, I suddenly realized I was witnessing something I would never have believed had I not seen it with my own eyes. This Bigfoot family lived with sharing, patience, and ordinary care for one another. Qualities humans often pride themselves on, as uniquely ours were present naturally in a secret community that had quietly existed deep in the forest for generations. By the morning of the 3rd day, the young Bigfoot's condition had clearly improved. The fever had faded to a low warmth, its eyes were no longer as exhausted as they had been 2 days earlier, and from time to time it could sit up for a few minutes before leaning back against its mother's shoulder. After changing the bandage and checking the wound, I used simple gestures to explain that it should not put weight on the left leg yet. Of course, I did not know how much the family understood, but the mother watched each movement carefully and nodded slightly, as if remembering everything. When the morning work was finished, I sat near the fire to sharpen the small surgical knife I had used on the first night. The steady sound of stone against steel rang through the quiet air. I was thinking about how many more days my medicine would last when I felt someone watching me. Looking up, I saw the young Bigfoot sitting only a few feet away. It used both hands on the ground to keep balance, its eyes wide with curiosity as it watched every movement of my hands. When it noticed I had seen it, it did not act shy. Instead, it moved a little closer. I smiled and continued sharpening as usual. The child tilted its head, watching with great focus, as if trying to understand why the blade made that sound. When I set the knife down, it looked at a flat stone nearby, picked up a small branch, and copied the sharpening motion with a very serious expression. The branch, of course, did not change, but its concentration made me laugh. That sound made several adult Bigfoot turn to look. The child looked up too, its eyes bright with amusement, because it realized it had done something that made me happy. Later, I took a piece of paracord from my backpack to repair the frayed strap of my medical bag. The child watched quietly again. I slowly threaded the cord through each hole and tied a neat knot. Only a few minutes later, the young Bigfoot found a thin vine and tried to copy each movement exactly. Its small hands were clumsy, and the vine kept slipping loose. It frowned at the tangled knot and tried again with determination. I sat beside it, gently took the vine, and performed the movement more slowly so it could see every step. The child watched closely, then tried again. On the third attempt, it finally made a simple knot. The moment it saw the result, it turned toward the mother with clear pride. The mother released a low, warm sound, and the father, who was chopping wood nearby, stopped to look at the child and smiled in a way easy to recognize through his eyes and relaxed face. A little later, I needed to build up the fire to boil water for sterilizing tools. I arranged several dry branches into a small cone, then used a fire striker sent sparks into dry grass. The young Bigfoot sat close and watched from beginning to end. When the flame became steady, it pushed itself toward its own small pile of wood and carefully arranged a few branches the same way it had just seen. Of course, it had no fire striker, but it still completed each step with great seriousness. I handed it a small burning branch and pointed to the dry grass. The child followed. Within seconds, a tiny flame rose. Its eyes shone with delight, and the other young Bigfoot immediately ran over to sit around it, staring at their friend's success. The clearing filled with short, deep sounds, one after another. At first, I thought they were exchanging something important. But when I saw the relaxed expressions on the whole group, I realized it sounded more like laughter than anything else. The father gently rubbed the child's head, and the elder sitting near the large fire gave a small nod of satisfaction. Watching that, I suddenly remembered weekends many years earlier when I taught a neighbor's grandson how to tie fishing knots and start a fire in the woods. Children, no matter what species they belong to, seem to carry the same excitement for learning and the same simple joy when they succeed at something new. Those small moments slowly erased the distance between me and the Bigfoot family, leaving behind a familiar warmth I never expected to find in a secret valley, marked on no map. That afternoon, after changing the young Bigfoot's bandage, I took a moment to reorganize my medical bag and check how many supplies I still had. Everything was packed neatly, because that was a habit I had kept from my ranger days. While taking a roll of gauze from the lowest pocket, I accidentally dropped my old compass onto the stone floor. It bounced twice, rolled off the animal hide, and kept sliding toward the ground near the entrance of the stone hollow. That compass would mean nothing to most people, but to me, it was the last keepsake my father left me before he passed away. He gave it to me on my first day as a ranger, and told me that maps can be wrong, trail markers can disappear, but a good compass will always remind you which direction you are facing. From that day on, I carried it on almost every trip into the forest. Before I could stand, the young Bigfoot was already moving toward the compass on both hands. Since its left leg could not bear weight yet, it moved slowly, but its eyes stayed fixed on the small object lying on the ground. When it reached it, the child gently picked up the compass with both hands, carefully brushed away a few pine needles stuck to the metal face, and returned to me. Instead of handing it back immediately, it stopped in front of me for several seconds, lowering its head to look at the compass resting in its palms. The needle still turned steadily before settling toward north. Perhaps that movement made it curious. After watching for a while, the young Bigfoot lifted its head and extended both hands toward me, as if returning something very precious. I took the compass and smiled, gently patting its shoulder. The child released a small, happy sound before leaning back against its mother's arm. I opened the compass lid, looked at the faded engraving of my father's name inside, and suddenly remembered those early days when he and I walked through the woods together, learning how to read terrain and find direction. It had been many years since I had last spoken about him to anyone. Yet, in that secret valley, a child from a species the world still considered legend accidentally helped me remember that the most precious keepsakes are never valuable because of the object itself, but because of the love carried inside them. By the third day, I had almost grown used to the rhythm of the Bigfoot family's life. Every morning, before I fully woke, a flat piece of wood used like a small table was always placed beside my sleeping spot. On it there was always a gourd of clear creek water and several freshly picked wild fruits. No one stood waiting to see my reaction or hoping for thanks. Everything appeared quietly, as if it were a natural part of their lives. After breakfast, when I prepared to change the young Bigfoot's bandage, an adult Bigfoot brought a bundle of fresh leaves and roots. It placed them beside me and pointed toward the child's leg. I picked them up and smelled them, immediately recognizing the familiar scent of several herbs that experienced woodsmen in Montana often used to reduce swelling and provide mild antiseptic effects. I did not know what they called those plants, but I understood that this family had also accumulated healing knowledge across generations, just as humans had. I selected several intact leaves, crushed them lightly, and placed them around the outside of the bandage to help keep the wound cool. The mother watched each movement carefully, then remembered it with great attention. While I worked, the father quietly brought more dry wood to the fire, and two younger Bigfoot took turns carrying water from the creek. No one had to be asked. Each individual seemed to know their role. As the sky leaned toward evening, I went to the creek to wash a few clean bandage strips again. When I returned, I discovered my resting spot had been made neater than before. The animal hide was spread flat, the medical backpack placed neatly beside the rock wall, and my boots had been moved to a dry spot to avoid nighttime moisture. I looked around, but I did not know who had done it. The mother Bigfoot only smiled with her eyes and continued caring for her child. Perhaps to them, helping someone who was helping their family was completely natural, not something that needed to be mentioned or praised. That night, as I sat alone beside the low fire, I suddenly realized we had still never exchanged a single sentence we could fully understand. Yet in those 3 short days, the gourds of water, the bundles of herbs, the shared food, and countless quiet gestures had created an understanding deeper than many conversations I had had in my life. That afternoon, after returning from the grove of ancient pines, I gave the young Bigfoot one more careful examination before making my final decision. I removed the bandage from that morning, observed the color of the skin around the wound, and gently checked the swelling with my fingertips. New tissue had begun to form. The inflammation had dropped significantly, and the child's body temperature had nearly returned to normal. With my years of ranger experience, I knew the most dangerous phase had passed. From now on, the most important thing was keeping the wound clean, changing the bandage regularly, and preventing the leg from bearing weight too early. I took out the remaining rolls of gauze, divided them into smaller portions, and placed them neatly on an animal hide. Then I took out each medicine, pointed to its label, and slowly demonstrated each step as if teaching an apprentice. I opened the antiseptic bottle, poured a moderate amount onto gauze, cleaned around the wound, and replaced the bandage. Then I handed each item to the mother Bigfoot and had her repeat the process. At first, her movements were a little clumsy, but after watching she did it fairly well. I nodded lightly to show satisfaction. The father stood close too, watching the entire process with careful attention. I took a small stick and drew a rising sun and then a setting sun in the dirt. Then I pointed at the young Bigfoot's leg and the bandage roll. I repeated the gesture twice to explain that the bandage needed to be changed 2 times a day. The mother looked at the drawing for a long time, then used one finger to draw it again in the exact order I had shown. When she saw me smile to confirm it, she nodded with deep concentration. After that, I pointed to my own leg, took a few normal steps, then switched to limping the way the young Bigfoot had been doing. Next, I gently waved both hands in warning and pointed to the ground in front of the child, meaning it needed more rest before walking too much. The young Bigfoot seemed to understand. It looked at its leg, then obediently sat down, making both me and the father laugh. Without a single word, we could still communicate the most important things. When everything was finished, I packed away the tools I was keeping and looked around the valley one more time. Only 4 days earlier, this place had been a completely unknown corner of the forest, and the beings standing before me had existed only in spoken stories. Yet now, I was spending time teaching them how to continue caring for their child after I left. I suddenly realized trust is always built from very simple things: a hand willing to help, patience long enough for others to understand you, and a sincere wish to keep life alive. Sometimes those things carry more power than any language in the world. On the morning of the 5th day, I woke earlier than usual, not because of the wind moving through the pines or the familiar cold of the Montana mountains, but because I knew it was time to return to my cabin. I sat for a while longer beside the low-burning fire, quietly watching a thin trail of smoke rise into the clear sky. 4 days earlier, I had entered this valley full of caution and countless questions. Now, as I prepared to leave, the strongest feeling inside me was attachment. I stood and checked the young Bigfoot's wound one last time. The bandage was dry, the skin around the ankle had clearly reduced swelling, and the child could place the foot lightly on the ground for a few seconds without grimacing in pain. I gently rubbed its shoulder and smiled. The young Bigfoot looked at me with bright eyes, then slowly took my hand with both of its small hands, the same way it had done since the first day it woke from its fever. The gesture was so simple that it needed no explanation. I felt the trust it had given me, and I also knew I would remember those eyes long after leaving this place. I turned to pack my medical backpack. Used rolls of bandage were tied neatly together, and several tools were cleaned before being returned to their familiar places. I kept only enough medicine for future trips, while all the remaining antiseptic, painkillers, and gauze were placed into a cloth pouch and given to the mother Bigfoot. She accepted it with both hands and bowed slowly. The father stepped beside her and placed one large hand on his chest before turning toward me. Over the past several days, I had come to understand that gesture as a sincere thank you. I answered by placing my own hand over my chest and giving a small nod. We did not need an interpreter. Both of us understood what that moment meant. When I put the backpack on my shoulder, the entire Bigfoot family stood in a line near the trail leading out of the valley. No one tried to keep me there. They only quietly sent me off with peaceful eyes. I had only taken a few steps when I heard very soft footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw the young Bigfoot standing on its good leg, limping after me. I smiled, lowered myself to its level, and gently placed my hand on its head. I pointed to the bandaged leg, then back toward the family, reminding it that it needed more rest. The child looked at me for a few seconds, then obediently turned back. Before joining its parents, it turned around once more and waved in the clumsy way it had learned during the days I was there. I raised my hand and waved back. In that moment, I understood that some meetings last only a few days, yet are enough to change the way a person sees the world for the rest of their life. I left the valley just after the sun rose above the highest pine tops. The father Bigfoot led me to the exact creek where we had first met in the darkness. From there, he stopped. He looked toward the trail leading to my cabin, then looked at me for a long time. After several quiet seconds, the creature slowly bowed its head, placed a hand on its chest, and stepped back. I understood this was farewell. I also placed my hand over my chest, using the gesture I had learned during those days. We both smiled very faintly. Then he turned back toward the forest and quickly disappeared behind moss-covered pines. I stood there for a while, listening to the wind move through the branches before continuing toward my cabin. The path was still the familiar trail I had walked countless times during my years as a hunter. But the feeling in my heart was completely different. Every rock, every creek, and every patch of woods now reminded me that somewhere beyond those deep forests, a secret family was continuing its peaceful life. And I carried with me a promise to keep that secret for the rest of my days. In the weeks that followed, my life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Every morning I still lit the fire, made coffee, checked the traps, and walked the old trails through the Montana woods. From the outside, no one would have noticed anything different. But each time I passed the tall pines or heard the creek running between rocks, I remembered the secret valley I had promised never to reveal. I never marked its location on a map, nor did I leave any sign along the trail. I understood very well that if even one curious group of hunters or a few thrill-seekers found the place, the peace of that Bigfoot family would end. So, the memory remained only in my own mind. A few days after returning, I opened the small wooden cabinet in the cabin and looked at the medical supplies I had left. I took several bottles of antiseptic, some fresh gauze, and 2 packets of mineral salts, then placed them all in a cloth bag. The next morning I carried the bag to the fallen tree beside the creek, where the father Bigfoot had stopped before saying goodbye to me. I placed it down, covered it with a dry pine branch to protect it from dew, and quietly returned home. I did not wait for anyone to appear. I did not look back. It was simply something I felt I should do. 2 days later, while checking the area, I stopped by the old fallen tree. The bag was gone. In its place was a bundle of dry firewood tied neatly with vines, and 3 very fresh salmon placed on a flat stone. I stood still for a few seconds, then laughed. The gift was not luxurious, but it meant more than any spoken thank you. From that day on, this silent exchange became part of my life. Every few weeks, whenever I had extra medicine or mineral salts, I left them at the familiar tree. In return, I sometimes received freshly picked wild mushrooms. Sometimes there was honey stored inside a hollow piece of wood. Other times, it was only a few carefully chosen branches of firewood that would burn long through winter. We never met at that spot. Everything happened quietly, like a promise both sides were keeping. That winter came earlier than usual. A snowstorm lasting 2 full days nearly erased the road leading into the forest. On the morning after the storm passed, I opened my cabin door and spent almost an hour shoveling away the thick snow from the porch. When I had just finished, I noticed many new pieces of evenly split wood stacked beside my firewood pile. I knew for certain I had not done that before the storm. The footprints around the cabin had almost been covered by fresh snow, but at the forest edge, several very large prints still stretched away before disappearing behind the pines. I walked closer and touched one still perfectly shaped footprint with my hand. A strange warmth rose inside me, despite the freezing weather. Perhaps while I was trapped in the cabin by the snowstorm, the Bigfoot family had quietly come and added firewood so I would not have to worry about heat. They still remembered me, just as I still remembered them. Since the day we met, there had never been a spoken promise between us. Yet through those simple actions, both sides were protecting a relationship built entirely on trust, gratitude, and kindness, something the vast forest had accidentally brought to both species. Winter slowly retreated, making room for the first spring days when the snow began melting on the Montana slopes. One morning, after checking the creeks where salmon were preparing to swim upstream, I returned to the cabin just as the sun rose above the pines. When I reached the porch, I stopped. On the ground before the door sat an object carefully placed. It was a wreath woven from young willow branches, soft and flexible, mixed with early wildflowers and several colorful bird feathers tied skillfully with dry grass. I bent down and picked it up. Each knot was firm, and the arrangement of the willow branches was so balanced that I knew whoever made it had spent much time and patience. It was not created randomly. It was a gift prepared with great respect. I looked around the forest in front of the cabin. Everything was quiet like any other morning. Only a few small birds moved through the branches, and creek water flowed nearby. I smiled, gently carried the wreath inside, and hung it on the wooden wall above the stove. where before there had only been Hannah's old photograph and my father's compass. From that day on, the wreath remained there. Whenever I lit the fire on cold evenings, I often looked up at it and remembered the Bigfoot family in the secret valley. Many people still ask why I lived alone in the woods for so long without feeling lonely. I only smile and change the subject. They will never understand that some friendships do not need frequent meetings, letters, or promises. Simply knowing that somewhere in this vast forest, quiet neighbors are living peacefully and that I am also helping protect that peace is enough for loneliness to fade on its own. The little wreath on the wooden wall reminds me every day that sincere gratitude always finds a way to remain, even after the ones who gave it have quietly returned to their own forest. Many years have passed since that special autumn. I have never led anyone to the valley hidden deep among the mountains, and I have never told this story to the people around town. To most people, Bigfoot is still only a legend mentioned beside campfires or in adventure stories. I do not try to change their minds. Some secrets are kept not because we fear being laughed at, but because we want to protect the lives that once placed their full trust in us. Sometimes, when I walk through the old forest, I still find large footprints pressed into damp soil after rain, or a few branches arranged in a very familiar way. I always smile and keep walking, as if I have just received a greeting from neighbors on the other side of the woods. If anyone asked me what the most precious thing I brought back from that meeting was, I would say it was not proof that Bigfoot exists. The most precious thing was that I learned gratitude, love for family, and kindness have never belonged to only one species. They belong to every heart that knows how to cherish the life of another. Thank you for staying with Victor until the end of this story. What a beautiful story, right, everyone? If Ethan's story truly happened somewhere in a Montana forest, the thing that makes me think the most is not whether Bigfoot exists or not. What I remember most is the moment a creature strong enough to break a tree trunk chose to kneel before a human being. That was not an act of strength. It was the act of a father after every other choice had run out. To save his child, he was willing to set aside fear, pride, and even the distance between two species to place his trust in someone he had probably always avoided before. On the other side, Ethan also made a decision that not everyone would be calm enough to make. He had every reason to pull the trigger. Before him stood a giant creature the world still sees as a threat, but instead of letting fear lead him, he chose to observe. He looked into Bigfoot's eyes instead of only looking at its size. Sometimes, slowing down for just a few seconds to truly see the one standing before us can completely change the ending of a story. Perhaps that is also what nature has always been quietly teaching humanity. Many animals do not come to humans because they want to be tamed. They come only when there is no other path left to protect what they love most. Love for children, the bond of family, and the instinct to protect loved ones are not privileges belonging only to humans. They are values that appear in many living beings on Earth. In this story, Ethan did not save an entire species. He only saved one child, but sometimes kindness does not need to change the whole world. Changing the fate of a single life is already enough to create ripples that travel far. One decision to lower a gun created a friendship that lasted for years. One healed wound built a bridge between two worlds that had always been suspicious of each other. And a thank you expressed through silent bows may be far more memorable than many beautiful words. Whether you believe Bigfoot exists or see this only as an emotional story, I still hope its message stays with you longer than the images in the tale itself. Do not judge anyone too quickly by appearance. Do not let fear decide in place of compassion. And never forget that kindness often begins with very small actions, but it can be remembered for a lifetime. Thank you for staying with Bigfoot Sasquatch Story until the final moments. If this story made you smile, moved you, or left you with a thought, please take a moment to hit like to support the channel. Do not forget to subscribe to Bigfoot Sasquatch Story and turn on notifications so you do not miss new stories about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and the emotional mysteries of the North American wilderness. I would also love to read your thoughts, so leave a comment below. If one day you were Ethan and a mysterious creature knocked on your door at night to ask for help, what would you do? I'm Victor. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again in the next story, where perhaps another secret is still waiting to be told somewhere among the silent forests.